Good to see everybody, both online as well as in person. When I was a kid, 10 or 11 or so, we went to the skating rink almost every day. Now, when I say skating rink, I'm not talking about where you pay hourly all this money to get these bougie lessons from people that help you become professional skaters, or where it costs a lot of money as well to play hockey. I know some of you hockey parents is like, wow, no, we didn't do that. We went to the park because every park in my hometown in La Crosse, every park, they would flood and became a skating rink. And so that was just the thing we did after school. So every day after school, we'd go skating, and it was always cold enough there to be able to do it. And there was always a warming house, and there was a caretaker it was an open fire in a fireplace there, so it was really a cool thing, great hangout. So anyway, I went with my siblings, and I was with my little brother, and he was quite a bit younger than me. I was 11 or so, and he was probably 4 or 5. And these kids that I didn't know, they didn't go to my school. I didn't see them there often, but there was a couple of kids, one in particular, that started picking on him. And he was like 4 or 5 years old. I don't know if they thought he was in their way or what. And I said, hey, leave my brother alone. And the kid said, whoa, what are you going to do about it, punk? Squirt, why don't you come on over here? We'll just turn you into a hockey puck. And then he shoved my little brother. You know, he's on skates. I don't know what happened to me, but not like I was typically emotionally well-balanced, but something welled within me, and all I could see was red, and I was so angry. I went after that guy, and I could skate pretty well. I started skating right towards him, and my fists were like a windmill, and all I saw was a look on his face like he was shocked that I was coming after him, because I was a little guy, and he was a pretty big guy. And he started backing up, and one of those fists landed somewhere on his body. I don't know where, but remember, he's on skates. So he slipped, fell backwards, landed on his butt. I jumped on top of him, and I'm still pummeling the guy. And fortunately, there was an adult nearby who intervened, not because I would have beat him bloody, but because he would have beat me bloody. He would have flipped me over eventually, and I cleaned my clock. But the adult pulled me off and pulled us apart while he was cursing at me and wanted to get at me. And you know the feeling, though, right? When you see an injustice, maybe it's done to you or to someone else, something rises up in you and you're saying, man, this isn't right. Somebody says something about you. It gets back to you through the grapevine, and you're thinking, that's totally false. I got to combat that. I got to set the record straight, protect my reputation. Or somebody takes your sale at work. They take credit for that. I'm the one that did that. And you're thinking, I need to squash this stupidity. You see something online, it's like, oh, and you got to combat whatever it is that they said. You get all this keyboard courage and write all these nasty things. Someone bullies your child. How do you feel in those situations? Or they honk and scare some poor old lady on a crosswalk. So what do we do in these situations? Seek justice? Do we practice mercy? Because there is this tension. The prophet Micah wrote that we're to seek justice and at the same time love mercy. In fact, we look at this verse and we think, okay, which one though? Which one? You can't have both at the same time. To seek justice is to set aside mercy. So which one? But Jesus actually tells us in this case that you can have your cake and eat it too. That we're to do both. And the problem is that these two pursuits in our minds contradict, but in Jesus' teaching, they don't. So we're going to look at Matthew 5, verse 7. So grab your Bibles and take a look at this. It's page 809 if you're using one of those blue hardcover Bibles in the chairs. Otherwise, grab your phone and whatever you would like, and let's take a look at this together. You've got notes as well in our bulletins. I encourage you to take notes, or you can use the notes that are online. It's easy to do it that way as well. And then you can actually email them to yourself and keep a record of them. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, this is your word. We believe it is true. We receive what it says. In the name of Jesus, open our hearts and engage our minds. Amen. So, of course, as you recall, that this is the Sermon on the Mount, which is the greatest sermon that Jesus preached, greatest sermon ever preached. And a huge crowd had gathered for this. And we've been in this for a few weeks, but this huge crowd, or the crowds that would follow Jesus and listen to him preach, the Pharisees aren't happy about this. I mean, this is a much bigger crowd than they ever got, either in their synagogue travels or even when they tried to do some open-air teaching. Never did they get these kinds of crowds. What was it about this man that drew so many? Well, of course, his healing of people. That would draw people in. But there was something different about him from the religious leaders of that day that people were attracted to. Now, these people had grown up with religion integrated in their lives and their whole lives. They went to the synagogue every Sabbath. They went to the temple for special occasions. There were the festivals year-round. They had their synagogue schools. They had grown up learning the Torah. They had entire chapters, and some of them even entire books of the Bible memorized. I mean, they had the law. They knew the law inside and out. I mean, it was a beautiful part of their culture. But the whole system of teaching that they received was bent towards justice, not mercy. Jesus comes along, and he's this perfect combination of justice and mercy. Now, they knew that Yahweh was a God of mercy because they knew the scriptures, and the Bible declares that Yahweh was a God of mercy, but they weren't seeing too much of that. And especially when it came to the religious leaders, that they were always driven towards the rules and consequences. But this man's teaching, well, he pulls no punches, and he's extremely practical, and at times he's pretty harsh, very strict, in some ways stricter than the Pharisees. But he teaches with a mercy that feels foreign, and it draws them in. So we read in verse 7, Jesus says, "Blessed are they merciful, for they shall receive mercy." Now, what does that mean, to be merciful? They hadn't seen much of that from people, especially their religious leaders. So what is mercy? Now, back in my Bible college Bible, I would use that Bible, and then we had daily chapel and all the classes I had in the back of the Bible. Whenever I heard something that I learned, something cool, it was said in a concise way, I'd write it in the back of the Bible. In the back of my Bible, I have this: grace is getting what you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve. You may have heard that. For example, my granddaughter, one of my granddaughters, she played soccer a couple of years ago, and she was terrible. And she was terrible because she didn't care. She doesn't have a competitive bone in her body. She's a social butterfly. She just wants to get along with people. And she enjoyed all of the friendships. But when it came to the actual game, she did not want to play. She just wanted to sit on the side and talk to her friend. And they would put her in, and she would say, "No, I want to talk to my friend." And she didn't want to go in. And season, she touched the ball one time, and that was by accident. And then she apologized to the boy for getting in his way. At the end of the season, however, she got a trophy. Of course, those famous participation trophies. And I'll never forget, her dad said to her, "That trophy is grace. You not getting kicked off the team was mercy." That's the difference between grace and mercy. It's pretty simple, but the confusion comes in the application. What does mercy actually look like in your office? That coworker who takes credit from something you were supposed to get credit for, or that ex who cheated on you, or that family member who takes advantage of you. Do we protect our family? Do we protect ourselves? Or do we give mercy? Does mercy mean that an employer can never fire an employee? You got an employee who is toxic, harming the workplace because you're sanctioning incompetence by keeping him there, or harming team culture. But Jesus calls us to mercy. So should you keep them because of it? Or is that not merciful to the rest of the team? Is it wrong to imprison criminals? And even what about Jesus? Jesus at one point made a whip, went into the temple, and drove out money changers in the temple with a whip. That doesn't sound very merciful. Was Jesus being a hypocrite? That's some pretty big questions. I mean, merciful, does that mean that you let yourself be walked on? Well, actually, the answer is sometimes. Well, let's look at the biblical framework and examine the messy combination of justice and mercy. And we're going to start by talking about what mercy is not. So, first of all, mercy does not enable. Mercy is not enabling. To enable wrongdoing or destructive behavior in the name of mercy is just that's not what mercy is. To enable children to continue being disrespectful, that's not merciful. To enable family members who are addicts to continue on with their addiction, or to enable gossips by listening to their gossip. We sometimes, we excuse this by saying, well, I'm just being merciful to them, but biblical mercy does not enable sin. Jesus didn't enable sin. In fact, when he addressed the woman caught in adultery, he didn't say, hey, don't let them judge you. You do you. I'm merciful. Don't worry about it. Actually, Jesus was the only one qualified to give her what she deserved, but he withheld it. Yet at the same time, he didn't excuse her sin. He said, go and sin no more. In fact, in a lot of situations, the merciful thing to do is to not enable, and sometimes in those cases, to be merciful, sometimes you don't look merciful. Because mercy aims at the long-term benefit of the person who you're being merciful to, and that might hurt in the front end. So mercy does not enable. Secondly, mercy does not just look the other way. That's not mercy. I know parents is tough sometimes. Our kids are really good at being naughty and cute at the same time, aren't they? It's really hard to deal with a situation where they're being naughty and they're cute at the same time. You just kind of turn your head and smile. But the trouble is, looking the other way, that's not mercy. That's bad parenting. That's not merciful. That's harmful to the child, looking the other way. But Jesus was merciful, but he didn't look the other way. Zacchaeus. Remember Zacchaeus, the wee little man was he? I never liked that song. I always thought that people were thinking of me when they were singing it. But Zacchaeus, Jesus was merciful to Zacchaeus, but at the end of the story, he had consequences. He paid back 4 times what he had defrauded people. He was a poorer man after his interaction, a much poorer man after his interaction with Jesus than he was before. Jesus was merciful, but Jesus didn't just look the other way when it came to his sin. So mercy doesn't look the other way. It calls sin sin. It doesn't give the person everything that they deserve, but it does address the sin and even allows there to be healthy consequences for it. And then mercy also is not compromise. I think we often think this way when it comes to there's a dispute between a couple of people that matter to us. They may be close to us, maybe people in the office or people in our small group or our friends circle or family. And oftentimes, what we think is, well, they just need to get together and meet halfway. And sometimes I think that can be healthy, but not always. I think some think that to be merciful, you have to compromise, you have to come together in the middle. But think about the logic behind this. If that's how the evil one, if that's how the devil were to work with us, every time he attacks doing the right thing, if we're going to compromise, we're meeting him halfway. We're giving him a foothold. He's gaining ground. So he just attacks again, and then we meet him halfway again, and he's gaining more ground. So logically, this doesn't work. The fact is, the truth is not always somewhere in the middle, as we often say, well, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's not. Maybe sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes this guy is just plain lying, and what he says is offensive to another person. So mercy doesn't necessarily compromise. I had a friend who said about mutual friends when one was clearly in the wrong, he said, well, they're probably both wrong. And I said, no way. I said, Jim, clearly, he sinned. This was wrong what he did. And he's in sin. It's not fair to John to make the assumption that, well, they're probably both wrong. And it's not very helpful to Jim either, just letting him off the hook. So mercy isn't compromising. Jesus was greatly opposed by the religious leaders of his day, by pagans, and sometimes by his own followers, but Jesus never budged. He never met people in the middle. He doesn't meet us halfway either. He points out our sin, but his mercy absorbed it on the cross. And he didn't say, well, it's partly my fault. No, he says, it's all your fault. It's your sin. But he treats us with mercy. He absorbs our sin on the cross. So you can be merciful and still seek justice without compromising. Also, mercy does not remove boundaries. It's not the removal of boundaries, especially when dealing with an addict or an abusive situation. To be merciful, you have to be somewhat vulnerable, yes, but you still need boundaries. Jesus was merciful, but he protected his alone time and his time with God. Even though there were times when people seemed to need him, despite the fact that he was so merciful for people, he still protected his boundaries, still protected the time that he needed for himself, as well as teaching time with his disciples. So I think healthy boundaries, they create healthy relationships, and you can be merciful, you can be vulnerable as Jesus was, but still have some boundaries. In fact, when you think about it, Jesus, he was vulnerable when it came to people capturing him, but yet he would not allow himself to be captured until the time was right. He kept his boundaries up. So now we've deconstructed mercy. Let's reconstruct it biblically. What does mercy do? Well, first of all, mercy does believe the best. Mercy believes the best. That's one of our staff values, believe the best. It sounds great, but it's not necessarily easy to do. I used to do a fair amount of couples counseling, marriage counseling, pre-marriage counseling, and I learned you can so quickly get into the weeds just because of what people are assuming about each other that I actually learned fairly quickly on that 75% of what I needed to do was just to teach couples to start believing the best about each other. Because so much of the problems that we have is we start making assumptions. And if married couples believe the best about each other, most of their problems would disappear, meaning that then the remainder of the problems that they have, which are in the minority, they now have the strength to be able to handle those problems because they're not dealing with all of the other stuff that's going on in their minds and their imaginations and their assumptions about each other. That's actually not our natural tendency. Our tendency is we judge motives, why you did this, or I know why you said that. Or we just assume we heard something and so there must be a negative motive behind it. Or we tell ourselves stories. We assume, and we don't have all the information. We fill in the gaps with our assumptions. We often think the worst. That's why so many stupid things live in our heads. It's funny because we love to be around people who believe the best about us, but the more we get to know each other, the harder it is for us to do that with others. Well, mercy assumes and believes the best, does not jump to conclusions, does not fill in the gaps with their own thoughts and imaginations. It doesn't justify sin or excuse wrongdoing, but it withholds judgment and doesn't see the need for deserved retribution. Also, mercy engages the mess. Mercy does engage the mess because mercy is sometimes illogical and it requires some vulnerability. It's messy. To seek justice but love mercy, that's a messy pursuit. There's no one size fits all for every situation. And in fact, sometimes loving another person requires you to let them face consequences. Sometimes mercy, I think, requires this. When our kids were growing up, Linda and I were ones that believed that there was a few things, whether open defiance or deliberate disobedience or lying was another one where we would spank. And on one of those occasions, Junior had, I shouldn't say one of those occasions, he had a lot of those occasions, but Junior had done something where it was an automatic spanking. And so I always sat down before the spanking. We talked and it was always done with love. And there was one occasion I thought, well, this is an opportunity for me to teach him some aspects of the gospel. And I said, tell you what, Scotty, I'm going to give you mercy. What does that mean? Well, mercy means that not getting what we deserve. And right now you have a spanking coming and I'm going to grant you mercy and I'm not going to do the spanking and we're just going to let this go. I could have taught him grace as well, and maybe he could have done what Jesus did, done the gospel. He could have spanked me and I could have given him ice cream. That's kind of what the gospel is, but I didn't go that far. Pastor Jordan did, however. He did, that's another story. So anyway, I gave him mercy. That's kind of funny because every time after this, I think we got somebody's phone going off there. Every time after this, Junior would then say, can I have mercy? Can I have mercy? So sometimes loving another person requires you to let them face consequences. The messiness of mercy requires a lot of thought. Somebody may want to help her. If somebody knows how to shut that off, maybe you can help her with that. The messy of mercy requires a lot of thought, conversations, and wisdom. Walking that line isn't easy. Being just and merciful at the same time isn't for those who just want to check boxes. In fact, I think that's why the religious leaders, why they had so much trouble to show mercy, because they were religious bureaucrats. To them, everything had to be logical and they had to have fair policies. Something that we often say is that we have few policies here at the Bridge and a lot of conversations. Oftentimes when somebody's trying to check out our church, they will say, well, we want a copy of all of your policies. Well, we just don't do that. Instead, we try to live out the scriptures. We don't have a lot of written policies. We just have conversations about things. Now, that makes it harder, but I also think it's more merciful and just. Now, sometimes, though, when you show mercy, you often take it on the chin yourself. That was Jesus. Jesus took it on the chin for showing mercy. Sometimes when you show mercy, you wind up absorbing consequences the other person deserves. I'm thinking I'm going to extend mercy here, and that might bite me later. But I'm still going to extend some boundaries and call sin sin, but I'm going to open myself for more potential hurt. It might cost me, but I'm still going to be merciful. Happened to me not that long ago where I truly extended mercy. It wound up hurting me in the short term. And someone says, well, would you do it differently? I said, no. I'd rather err on the side of mercy. Because that's what Jesus did and does for me. Now, some of us struggle to extend mercy because we don't like being vulnerable. Because it does make you vulnerable. But if we claim to follow the one who laid himself on a cross naked, we must accept his call to be, at times, vulnerable in our extension of mercy. Mercy is messy. So I want to give you a quick mercy test, a couple of questions for you. First one is, can you take a hit without swinging back? Look at verses 38 to 42. Jesus says, if someone slaps you, turn the other cheek. Be vulnerable and okay with possibly being hurt again. That's what he was saying. And then he goes on, he says, if someone takes your tunic, give them your cloak too. Give them what they don't deserve, and don't give them what they do deserve. Now, is that something that we do? When someone's slandering you, or accusing you of something, taking advantage of you, posting stupid stuff on socials, can you take a hit without swinging back? And some years ago, there was some drama in the church. Imagine that, drama in a church. I think sometimes what we forget is that when it comes to our relationships in church, there's so much emotion that is connected with it. And along with that comes some of those feelings. But we had some people that left angry, and they were maligning me behind my back. And of course, it was just explaining their viewpoint, but their explaining their viewpoint was always slanted towards their viewpoint and not necessarily slanted towards the truth. There were posts on social media, and I was the main target. We were in a meeting with some of our leaders just trying to figure out how should we properly respond in this. And there's this voice that just kind of comes into my head. It was from a major influence in my life years ago. I remember him saying, sometimes you gotta take a punch. So I just spoke up. I said, let's not complicate this because there's other family members that are involved. I don't want to hurt their family. There's no sense in us fighting. So let's just take a punch and keep doing what God's called us to do. Because God's called us to things that are so much bigger than trying to settle the score or make everybody aware of everything. Now, by the way, that's not in my nature. I grew up in a family where we always, we always had to identify who's at fault and then shame that person for whatever they were at fault at. In fact, I asked my wife, I said, can you remind me of so many stories I could use illustrations about when I went after justice and not mercy and should have been merciful? And she said, I don't know, there's just probably too many to count. So that's not in my nature. I lean far more towards justice. But Jesus was a man of mercy. So are you going to fight back, or are you going to fight the good fight? Mercy will take a hit and not swing back. Another question to ask ourselves, do you draw conclusions without the full story? Because I think when there's mercy, that's not something we're going to do. In fact, we're very slow. We're not going to be talking about it. And we do all this all the time. We draw conclusions, and I can as well, especially if I've got a buddy that I feel like if I trust him and he tells me a story about something somebody did to them, it's like, I want to get that guy. I want to go out in their office and tell his boss how poorly he's treating this person, even though we always say there's always another side, but we don't think that there's another side when it's one of our friends that we think was offended. And so we wind up drawing conclusions. And the merciful don't operate this way. In fact, the merciful often don't always try to get the full story. Oftentimes they say, I don't really care. I don't need to know. I'm not drawing any conclusions. I don't need to. But if it's something that involves me and I feel like I've got to find out more, I should have conversations instead of drawing conclusions. And some of us are really good at filling in the gaps of what we don't know with things in our own imagination. Like, I could see her saying that. I could see him doing that. And these are like our imaginations. That's not mercy. And suddenly we're making decisions on people and situations and workplaces based on a story riddled with discrepancies. And this is why Jesus, if you look in chapter 7, the first 2 verses in chapter 7, he says, stop judging. Because the measure by which you judge, you will be judged. Another question to ask ourselves is there someone you've written off? Let's be honest. There's some who can never win with you, right? They just never win. Anything they do is wrong. Your spirit is turned against them. And just about everything they do, the way you interpret their action or their words, you interpret it in a negative way because your spirit's turned against them. You're lacking mercy for them. And if what they do doesn't seem wrong, we tell ourselves that their motivation for doing even a good thing was wrong, or they just want attention. And it feels good to find something on them. They can't win with you. When our spirit turn against someone, and it happens between couples in a marriage, between sometimes parents and an older child, a high schooler, maybe the high schooler and the parent, where they can't win no matter what. Misinterpret every word that is said, sometimes between coworkers. Or maybe it's a boss, they did or do something that grates on your nerves and you just jump on that train to find anything that they do wrong because it justifies your feelings about them. Or maybe it's a family member, an in-law, or a coworker, or an ex. We write people off. And I agree, sometimes they probably deserve it. They hurt you. They took advantage of you. And they might even do it again if they could. They might deserve how you've written them off. But is that mercy? Mercy doesn't write people off. I'm sure there may need to be boundaries and truth matters. There might need to be some consequences for their benefit, but mercy never writes anyone off. Mercy looks for, hopes for, and chooses to believe the best. The problem is, instead of hoping for the best, we sometimes tell ourselves these negative stories. And then we look for evidence to back up the story we tell ourselves. So dangerous. Because according to Jesus, and what he is saying, if we are good at writing people off, we'll be written off. Because again, look at this. Blessed are the merciful. For it's they, the merciful, that shall receive mercy. Do you want God's mercy? I would hope so. You need it as much as I do. Jesus said, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive his mercy. The more you sit in this verse, the more heavy these words weigh. Because Jesus isn't playing around. The measure by which you judge, you will be judged. In fact, it seems like an unmerciful verse about mercy, doesn't it? You will get what you deserve if you need to give others what they deserve. Like, I'm going to say that again. You will get what you deserve if you need to give others what they deserve. So if you're always demanding justice, what would happen to any one of us if God always demanded justice in us? And to boil it down, this is the gospel. This is the gospel. God does demand justice, but in his mercy, Jesus came and absorbed the justice that was demanded of us, our sin. And that's all sin is. It's a violation of God's justice. It's doing what we want to do instead of what God wants us to do. It's turning away from him. It's a violation of his justice code. It's in his mercy that he came to absorb the penalty that we've brought on ourselves. And he went to the cross. And his mercy cost him dearly. It cost him torture. It cost him a horrible, painful death. That's what the gospel is. Jesus does not give us what we deserve. Instead, he gave us what he earned for us. And we can receive heaven because of his mercy and grace. We are living, breathing trophies of mercy. But what good is a trophy of mercy if we are not full of mercy ourselves? I mean, this is what it is to follow Jesus, to be purveyors of mercy. And yes, there are boundaries and wisdom and justice, but we must be pictures of mercy, and knowing full well that mercy is going to hurt us sometimes. But it hurt Jesus a whole lot more. And to follow him is to walk into that pain, that mess. I remember it well, the Gator Bowl of 1978. It was Ohio State versus Clemson, and it was a big game. With 5 minutes left in the game, Ohio State, which was one of the winningest programs of the 70s, they were down by 17 to 15, and they were down with 5 minutes left, but they had the ball. Now, Woody Hayes was the legendary coach of Ohio State, still one of the winningest coaches in all of college football history. With 5 minutes left, with Ohio State down, they had the ball, they were driving, they were in scoring territory, and unfortunately for Ohio State, the quarterback threw an interception to the nose tackle, who started running the ball back and eventually wound up out of bounds right in front of the Ohio State bench. And Woody Hayes, who was one of the most fiery people, I mean, he was a coach with all kinds of big personality and a lot of anger at times, and he was so into it and so angry that he ran over to the guy who intercepted the ball and punched him. The guy had a helmet on, but he punched him. It was right towards the end of the game. Oh, man, I mean, you can imagine what happened. He was fired, of course. The media had a heyday over this. And Woody Hayes, I mean, he wound up going into seclusion. He was ashamed. He knew that his legacy as one of the most winningest coaches ever, at the time, beloved coach of Ohio State, his legacy had been burned up in this one act. And then Coach Tom Landry steps into the scene. Now, if you know who Tom Landry was, he was the famed coach of the Dallas Cowboys, again, one of the most winningest NFL coaches in history. He was chill, even-keeled, hard to rattle. Woody Hayes, on the other hand, he was fiery, charismatic, had a temper. At the end of the same football season, Coach Tom Landry was invited to this prestigious banquet with other successful coaches and well-known athletes and sports figures. It was a bougie event. And Landry said this, because typically when he goes in, and typically he would have brought his wife. He brought his wife to all of these kinds of events. Instead of bringing his wife, he brought Woody Hayes to this banquet. It's the first time Woody Hayes had been seen publicly since what had taken place, almost a year before that. And I mean, this cost Landry some things with his own reputation. People were like, what? Why would you do that? This is like the most hated man in football right now. And Landry said this. He said, well, I figured since everyone else was beating up on Woody, someone needed to show him something different. Landry did take a hit, but he didn't care. And by the way, Tom Landry was an absolutely committed Christian. He believed in grace, practiced mercy, even when it cost him. Tom Landry's extension of mercy helped lift Woody Hayes out of his shame and silenced his tormentors. Now, I love that story, and I'll tell you why. Because the same thing happened to me. I've lost my cool. I've thrown punches. I've said terrible things. I've been incredibly selfish. I've followed my own desires contrary to God's. I've embarrassed myself. I've sinned time and again against my Creator. I deserve nothing short of hell. But the same one who sat on that rock and spoke these words also went to the cross so that I could walk with him into the greatest banquet. I deserve shame, but I'm invited to history's greatest party because I'm his trophy of grace. And mercy is the only thing that lifts me from my shame and silences my tormentors. You think about it. the Apostle Paul entered heaven to the cheers of those he persecuted and even murdered. That's how the gospel works. Those who embrace the cross of Jesus bleed mercy. Is that you? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Which leads to our so what question. I want you to think about your world. And what's going on right now? Who is it right now in your world who needs your mercy? And I get it. I get it. There's stuff going on all the time. And God's bringing along opportunities for us all the time. We go through these enjoyable periods. We go through these trials. Last couple of weeks, honestly, for me in ministry, it's been pretty tough. I think I had my worst day in ministry a couple of weeks ago. And 35 years of being a pastor. It's really hard particularly when it involves people that you had trusted. So who is it for you where that's the case? Who needs mercy for you? Is it maybe a husband? A coworker? Maybe someone in your small group? Someone here? Who in your world needs your mercy? Let's just sit in this for a moment. Allow for God to speak. You be open to what he's having to say right now.